welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you enjoy this conversation on Trendlines, you can get more of WPR's news and analysis directly in your inbox by registering for our free daily newsletter. You'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Until a couple weeks ago, the settlement of Moria on the Greek island of Lesbos was the largest refugee camp in Europe. It housed roughly 13,000 people in facilities that were designed to hold 3,000. But starting on the evening of September 8th, a series of fires swept through the camp, and by the end of that week, most of Moria had been reduced to a smoldering ruin. Greek authorities have charged 4 young Afghan migrants with arson in connection with the fires. With nowhere else to go, thousands of Moria residents have been left homeless without access to basic services. Their plight casts a harsh and damning light on the European Union, which, despite repeated attempts, has failed to find a humane way to handle the influx of refugees at its southern borders. My guest for today has been covering the latest developments on the ground in Lesbos. Matthew Cassel is a Vice News correspondent, and he's joining us from Athens, Greece. Matthew, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'll be honest with you and with our listeners, of all the shows I've prepared for, this one was probably the most difficult. It was hard even to come up with questions that do justice to the situation and that frame this topic in a new light, given it's been going on for so many years. I thought it would be good to start with a question that probably a number of our listeners are wondering about, which was why Moria was burned down by the very people who lived there. And this is a question I know you've been asking some of the camp's old inhabitants. What did they tell you?
Most people I've spoken with at this point, be they refugees themselves, government officials, or NGOs, now agree that it was most likely a number of asylum seekers, probably Afghans, who started the fire a week or two ago now that led to, the entire camp being burned down. And it's important to get into some context to understand why people would want to light a fire that resulted in the entire camp burning down. First of all, rights groups in Greece internationally have been calling for the Greek authorities to shut down the Moria refugee camp for years. Didn't happen. The numbers in the camp have swelled. And then earlier this year, when the coronavirus pandemic broke out, pretty much everyone, rights groups, government, former and current officials, media, everyone was warning the Greek government that if they did not shut down Moria, a crisis was going to happen there in the form of an outbreak of, COVID-19. They managed the camp was at 20,000 in March when lockdowns started happening in Greece and other places in Europe. They managed to get 7,000 people moved to the mainland. But the number was still 13,000 in the camp, which, like you said in your introduction, is well over the capacity. The camp was built for 3,000 people, so it was more than 4 times at capacity, and it managed to survive to not have any confirmed coronavirus cases for months. But that changed, unfortunately. About a month ago, there was one case, and that case, within a couple weeks, became 35. And the authorities, what they did when the numbers started to increase in the camp was they imposed a kind of lockdown of the camp, and they forced a number of people who had been in contact with some of those confirmed cases, whether they were relatives or neighbors, I'm not quite sure, into an isolated section. People in Moria are already fed up. They've been there months, years. The situation, as we said, was terrible in the camp. It's been widely condemned. And apparently this group of people were already frustrated, and now they're even more frustrated because they were put in isolation. It's not the first time a fire has been started in Moria, but a fire did happen that night. We're not sure if they were doing it as a form of protest, if they were doing it as a form of trying to break free from their isolation. What's probably safe to assume is they had no idea it was going to spread throughout the camp in the way that it did, but the conditions on Lesbos Island and around Greece that night were very dry, very windy. You had fires all throughout in different places throughout the country, And those conditions allowed for a fire that started in one small section to expand throughout almost the entire camp.
As you mentioned, this didn't just come out of nowhere. Moria has been around for many years now. And as we were talking about before we started recording, it takes a fire for it to jump back into headlines. But refugee advocates and human rights groups have been calling attention to the poor conditions there for a long time. And I think in 2018, a researcher for Human Rights Watch even called it an open-air prison. It wasn't meant to be like this, obviously, but how did things get so bad?
Yeah, a refugee camp, in my opinion, should not be a semi-permanent place where people are made to wait for months or years while their asylum claims are being processed. It's supposed to be a temporary space. You should, especially on a place like a Greek island where people were arriving from Turkey. And this is what happened I think it was built in around 2012. But let's say in 2015, when we all were familiar with the peak of the refugee arrivals to Greece and to Europe, people would arrive, they would get processed or register themselves very quickly on the island, and then they were allowed to continue their journeys to mainland Greece. Moria, not actually the overwhelming majority of refugees who arrived in 2015 didn't see Moria refugee camp, didn't set foot in it. They didn't have to. That everything changed in 2016 when Europe, in an effort or an attempt to try to, stop the flow of people that were coming from Turkey, asylum seekers that were coming from Turkey, um, made a deal with Turkey. It's called the EU, commonly referred to as the EU-Turkey deal. And one of the things the Greek government did at that time was implement geographic restrictions on asylum seekers who were coming to the islands, which meant that previously they would arrive to the islands, they would go almost immediately to mainland Greece, and then they would continue their journeys onwards to countries in Western and Northern Europe. But now they had geographic restrictions placed on them, which meant that they would arrive and they had to stay on the islands while their asylum claims were being processed, which at that time was taking months. It became even slower. And for some people, it took years. So, like I said, a refugee camp should be a temporary space. It's not built, it's not set up for people to live there for a long period of time. But that's exactly what was happening because people's asylum cases weren't being processed. And so it became a very bad place. It was, filthy. There was criminality in the camp, and people were calling on the government to close it. This was all happening under the former Greek government, Syriza, which is often referred to as a leftist government. Now, when the right-wing government came into power in 2019, they made it even harder for people to leave the islands by preventing vulnerable cases, meaning if you're pregnant, if you have small children, if you have serious injuries, if you have mental or physical health concerns, those people were allowed to leave and move to mainland Greece. But when this new government came into power, it made it even harder for people to do that. And most people are asylum seekers coming from war zones. They have vulnerable cases. They need to be moved. So people got even more stuck, more trapped on the islands. And that's how we saw the number of refugees swell, not only in Moria refugee camp, but other camps on Lesbos and other Greek islands close to the Turkish coast. We saw them swell by, thousands and thousands. And Moria, like I said, at one point earlier this year was at 20,000 people in a camp that was designed to hold only 3,000.
After the fire, when people were living on the street without any shelter, one woman you spoke with said she would rather live under siege than like this.
Yeah, obviously, it's not the Syrian civil war on the Greek island of Lesbos. There aren't bombs falling. There aren't people dying, at a number of dozens or hundreds every day. But people left that situation expecting something else from Europe, expecting Europe to, respect human rights. And so I think that's what's really hard for people to understand. They're coming from conflict zones. They don't have many expectations for, their Bashar al-Assad's government or the situation in Afghanistan to get better. They left. They made thousands of miles long journey to reach Europe that they've heard of as this place where human rights are respected. And then they get to Europe and they're made to wait and live in the most difficult of circumstances without getting any answers, without getting any updates about their asylum claim, without knowing when they're going to be able to restart their lives to live in the kind of safety and stability that they're desperate for. And so the camp burned down. And these people who had already fled their homes, the woman from Syria in particular, she had already fled her home multiple times in Syria. She had made this journey. She had a small child. She was pregnant. She got to Europe. She was waiting for months in the camp, and then it burns down, and she had no answers. No one was helping her. She was living on the side of the road. So you can understand why someone in a situation like that would say it's worse here than the situation in Syria, just because they expected some shred of dignity that they haven't yet seen by coming to Europe.
Authorities have now set up a new temporary settlement to replace Moria. And when I read about that, I couldn't help but think of the science fiction film District 9, the title of which refers to a refugee camp built to house members of an alien species that wind up on Earth when their spaceship malfunctions. There's an effort in the film to move the residents of District 9 to a new District 10, which is supposed to be much better, but in reality, the conditions are even worse, more cramped, more squalid. Is that what's happening here?
Like I was saying, the problem wasn't Moria. There wasn't this inherent problem with the Moria refugee camp or the place where Moria was located. The problem was that people were made to wait for months or years without getting any updates or any answers about their asylum requests. And they were being prohibited, denied the ability to restart their lives, to work for themselves, to study. Unless the asylum process is addressed and people are going to get information, they're going to be able to do things, to take care of themselves, to not rely on handouts. Unless those things change in this new camp, all the authorities have done is create a new Moria.
One of the more poignant moments, I thought, in your story was the family who fears that the rest of their lives are just going to be waiting in line endlessly for their asylum applications to be processed, for food, for water, for basic services, and that the only reality that their children will know is waiting in line.
I speak Arabic, and I've been covering this story for years now, and I've met thousands of asylum seekers coming through Greece. But something that struck me on this trip, and I've heard it, on recent trips to Lesbos as well, is one of the Abdullah, the young father I was interviewing, I was filming with in this piece. He said in Arabic, we don't speak any English, but the only word that we know in English is line, because every day they're shouted at by the authorities, by NGOs distributing food, get in line, form a line. And it's quite shocking to see. I saw it in Moria. I saw it out on the road too, on a greater scale, because in Moria there's different food distribution points. When the camp still existed. But on the road, it was complete and utter chaos. So there was really only one NGO that was able to come in and distribute food to 12,000 people almost. And you just saw basically half of that road. I mean, anyone who could, the young children obviously not, get up and form a line longer than any line I've ever seen. There were thousands of people in that line. And they were so well, it sounds terrible to say, but they were so well trained to form this line, because that's all their lives have become, living in a place like Moria, living in refugee camps on the Greek islands, is waiting in line. You cannot do anything for yourself. You cannot work. You cannot study. You can't take care of your family. You are literally left to be fed by the Greek government and NGOs. And of course, that's not what any refugee wants or is asking for. They want to be able to do this, to take care of themselves and their families on their own. And anyone out on that street, anyone former resident of Moria refugee camp will tell you that.
You mentioned the new right-wing Greek government that took over in 2019, led by Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis. Has there been any noticeable change in the waits that people have had to cope with for their asylum applications since then? Have things slowed down? Or is this just a consistent, ongoing problem of European governments not being willing to take people in?
It's hard to say yes and no. I mean, there's been a steady kind of decrease in the speed in which asylum requests have been processed here in Greece. That's clearly a move to deter other people from coming by not issuing, refugees with asylum soon after arriving. And then you can't blame it all on Mitsotakis because this year, all of us have struggled with the coronavirus, and they did have to shut down many of the asylum services that would process one's asylum request. So there were huge delays already this year in 2020 because of the coronavirus. But like I said, the bigger thing, and Syriza, the former left-wing Greek government, was also responsible for this. But the big thing, the big change that Mitsotakis did, because Mitsotakis, he ran on a platform of law and order, as right-leaning governments or right-wing politicians often do. So he wanted to, implement law and order in the country. And one of the things he wanted to do was to keep the camps more contained, more closed, not having refugees being moved back and forth around the country. And so something I mentioned earlier, he made it harder for people with vulnerabilities, meaning disabled, people with small children, people with severe injuries, etc. He made it harder for them to leave the islands. And all of these people became stuck on the islands, which caused, the numbers to swell in places like Moria refugee camp and just increased, the tension.
Some European leaders have actually argued that this harsh treatment that you're referring to does serve as a deterrent for people coming, and that treating refugees more humanely, with more dignity, setting up a more orderly system for processing asylum requests will only serve as a powerful pull factor, inviting more and more people to migrate to Europe. In some ways, it mirrors the Trump administration's tactics toward migrants and asylum seekers here in the U.S. trying to cross the southern border, that a cruel policy is necessary to keep people from coming. Have you seen or heard of any evidence that this is actually the case?
Personally, I'm a bit uncomfortable when I hear the term pull factor without talking also about push factor, because I think what has to be first and foremost in any discussion about refugees and migrants is that these are people who are not leaving because they want to. They're leaving because they feel they have no choice. And now, while conditions around the world are getting worse in many developing countries, we're only going to see people being pushed more and more out of their countries and trying to find the kind of safety and stability that many of us enjoy in Western countries. Now, so there's a clear place in policy by the European Union and its member states to try to deter more refugees and migrants from making the journey from either North Africa or Turkey and being able to reach Greece and seek asylum in Europe. That's definitely been happening since the peak of arrivals in 2015, 2016. Now, what they're doing in this effort to deter future migrants and refugees from making the trip to Europe is they're also violating European and international law. And I think if we're going to do that, if our states, our countries, our governments, those of us from the United States or from European countries, we need to have a democratic debate about this. And we need to acknowledge that we do not no longer follow refugee laws. We're no longer a group of countries that want to respect a refugee's right to asylum when they arrive in our countries. And we'll see if the majority of people want to support that or not, because I truly believe that they wouldn't. I think most people are sympathetic to the plight of refugees and migrants from around the world. But I think there's a lot of the politics of Western countries now, and there's a lot of cowering to the far right that has made this issue, first a priority in its platform and trying to use scare tactics about this invasion of refugees and migrants. But yeah, just in closing, I think there's a lot of, I think governments are kind of scared of certain right-wing elements in their countries that are very anti-refugee and anti-migrant. But at the same time, I'm optimistic because there's a lot of movements and people who, and I think the overwhelming majority of us who are more sympathetic to the plight of people who've left their homes and are seeking, a dignified life in our countries.
I suppose the tragedy of it, or part of the tragedy, is that it's so hard to have that kind of debate, that kind of democratic debate that you're talking about, because of the level of disinformation and hate and vitriol that enters the conversation. I know that here in the United States, there's so much conflating of illegal immigration with people who are coming up to the border and filling in their asylum applications in the lawful way, just as they're supposed to. And those people are often seen as people who are trying to enter the country illegally.
Yeah, and it's becoming really hard to work in as a journalist. I mean, it's facts. Information doesn't really seem to matter anymore. People are going to believe, you know, what they want to believe, and it's scary. You at one point, journalism has always had its issues. The industry has always had its issues, and I've been vocal about a lot of them in the past. But now it just feels like, you're kind of punching the air, and it's hard to kind of, even a lot of the work I do is based around individuals and their stories, and I try to do that because I want people to be able to empathize and understand, who those people are and what they've been through. But even when you do that kind of work now, someone's going to accuse you of someone's going to accuse him of being a crisis actor or lying or whatever it is, and it just makes it really, really hard to do our work and at least and have it make an impact. But we're definitely trying.
Germany has now offered to take in, I believe, 1,500 residents of Lesbos after the fire. That was one piece of good news for them. Many of our listeners will recall that Germany also led the charge at the height of the migration crisis in 2015, accepting more than 1 million refugees. Chancellor Angela Merkel took a lot of heat for that policy at the time. What do we know about how things have worked out in terms of how those refugees are doing now in Germany and how well they've integrated into German society, given that that was such a point of contention in Europe?
Yeah, I think Merkel has been vindicated for her 2015 policy, and there's actually been a number of reports in different publications over the past few weeks and months, because we're kind of at the 5-year anniversary of that move by Angela Merkel. And if you go, I don't know if you've been to Germany or any of your listeners have, but if you go to Germany now, you'll see that there is, this new population of Germans or soon to be Germans, people who sought asylum there over the years, but especially in 2015, 2016. And they've really integrated, and especially all the number of Syrians and Afghans who I met at that time. They are now very much German, for better or worse, living, in their little cold apartment in far-flung towns and cities around Germany, doing their job, working at banks, working at factories, speaking German, raising their children, contributing to the German economy.
Maybe not quite adapting to the food, but that's
Well, if you go to Kreuzberg in Berlin and other like kind of hip areas in other cities around Germany, what you'll see now is the most popular restaurants in Germany. I think it's safe to say are all Syrian restaurants. There's actual lines of last time I was there a couple of years ago, there were lines of dozens of Germans and others waiting outside these restaurants trying to get a table. So yes, I don't know if Syrians have necessarily taken on the German cuisine, but it's definitely, I think many Germans at least, are happy that their cuisine's being merged with that of the newcomers as well. So yeah, it seems to be, anecdotally from what I've seen, and reports indicate as well, that Merkel has been vindicated by allowing such a high number of people to seek asylum in the country in 2015.
Are you hopeful at all then that other European countries will follow Germany's lead this time around and allow in more asylum seekers?
No, and I'm not particularly hopeful. First of all, the EU-Turkey deal and the policies of the Greek government and other governments, Italy, in the Central Med region, have stopped, almost entirely stopped the flow of people who are coming to Europe. So there's going to be, there's a few dozen arrivals now every few weeks or so. So it's a very manageable number of people who are coming here. Am I optimistic that they're going to even accept the thousands who are on stuck on Lesbos and the other Greek islands now. No, I'm afraid I'm not, because they haven't until now. Like I said, this was a crisis that people have been warning about, for months, during the coronavirus pandemic, and even for years before that, when Moria was becoming, overflowing with people who were living in horrific conditions in the camp. And very few states took action. Some states did take a few hundred unaccompanied minors here and there. But the fact that they haven't taken people until now does not make me particularly optimistic that governments in Europe are going to all of a sudden say, sure, we'll take a large number of people. But what does make me optimistic is that there are a number of movements and groups around Europe, people who are naturally sympathetic with the plight of a lot of the refugees and migrants who are in places in Greece, and they're putting pressure on their governments to change their policies, and that does make me optimistic.
In response to the situation in Lesbos, the European Union is due to debate proposals for a new asylum and migration policy this week. I believe we're talking on Monday, and I believe some of the proposals will come out on Wednesday. What kinds of ideas do you think we might see? Do you think they'll be more adequate to the task at hand?
They're going to talk about relieving some of the pressure from border states, so like countries like Greece and Italy, who have received larger numbers of arrivals than Sweden or Ireland, just because of their proximity to the places that asylum seekers are leaving. There's going to be some of those kinds of changes. I don't think that there's going to be anything, radical, in the sense that they're going to ensure that all the people in camps and places like the Greek islands are going to be moved, are going to be given a right to asylum in places other than Greece, that all EU member states are going to take their quota, their share of of people who are currently seeking asylum. Because as we know, and the numbers show, there's states, especially in Eastern Europe, like Hungary, Poland, and some others, who are very adamant against accepting even, a handful of asylum seekers. So I'm not necessarily optimistic about that. And just to make the point that, this problem is not going to go away. There is definitely a refugee crisis. There is a migration crisis in our world today. And until we address the bigger themes of climate change, global inequality, conflict that's spreading around much of the world, there is going to continue to be people who are leaving home, not because they want to, but because they feel that they have to, and trying to seek refuge in countries that many of us are fortunate to have been born in and come from. So until we really come together, I know it sounds like a Herculean task, but until we come together as a global community and really work together to address some of these larger problems that people around the world are facing, this is going to continue to be an issue for years and decades to come.
I'm really curious about the people you speak with, and when the asylum seekers agree to be interviewed, do they express hope to you that more attention to this issue, to their plight, might galvanize that kind of conversation that you were just talking about and might lead to renewed calls for change?
For sure. One question that I am asked almost every time I have a camera and I ask an asylum seeker to tell me his or her story is, how is this going to benefit us? Or will this benefit us? Will this help us in any way? And every time I have to say the same thing: I don't know. I simply don't know. But, I tell them that all I can do is share their story to get their word out. And I think people who are living in these very difficult conditions, where they feel they're ignored and neglected, for them, that's a big thing. But both of us hope, as someone who has reported on this issue for many years and seen the horrific conditions that people are forced to live in, I hope, just as the asylum seekers do, that something will change in this issue. Because what happened in Moria last week, 2 weeks ago now, was horrific. But the conditions that people have been living in Moria and other refugee camps in Greece, in Europe, and especially the Middle East and Africa, are just as horrific, and we need to change that.
Matthew, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Matthew Cassel is a Vice News correspondent who's been covering the refugee crisis in Greece. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow us on Twitter. My handle is @Elliot Waldman. That's 2 L's, 1 T. Peter is @PETERDOERRIE. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.